お忙しいところご預かりいただきましてありがとうございます。これから世界学術講演、そして仏教ちょっと待って2013年の沼田仏教書籍優秀賞受賞記念講演会を始めさせていただきます。Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here to introduce Professor Daniel Arnold at Chicago University. Professor Arnold is an associate professor of the philosophy of religions, and he's a very famous scholar, as you know, in the philosophy, which he engages in constructive and comparative way. Considering Indian philosophy as integral to the broader tradition of Indian philosophy, he has particularly focused on topics at issue among Buddhist schools of thought, chiefly those centering on the works of Nāgārjuna and Dharmakirti, often considering these in conversation with critics from the orthodox Brahmanical school of Purva Mimamsa. His first book, Buddhist Brahmins and Belief, Epistemology in South Asian Philosophy of Religions, published in Columbia University Press in 2005, won an American Academy of Religion Award. And his second book, this one, Brains, Buddhas, and Believing, the problem of intentionality in classical Buddhists and the cognitive scientific philosophy of mind, as well, published in Columbia University Press in 2012, received the Toshi沼田Book Prize in Buddhism, awarded by the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And this work centers on the contemporary philosophical category of intentionality, which has something to do with the topic the professor will deal with in today's lecture. I'm taken as useful in thinking through central issues in classical Buddhist epistemology and philosophy of mind. He is presently working on an anthropology of Madhyamaka texts in translation to appear in a series of historical source books in classical Indian thought, edited by Sheldon Pollock, and it will appear in Columbia University Press. And his essays and papers, 52 in total number, including book reviews, have appeared in such journals as Philosophy East and West, the Journal of Indian Philosophy, Asian Philosophy, the Journal of the International Association of Buddhist Studies, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and the like. And I will briefly touch on the Toshi沼田Book Prize here. This is awarded on an annual basis to an outstanding book written in English in the area of Buddhist studies. The selection is made by an outside committee that is appointed annually. According to the comments published by the committee last year, the members of this year's committee were effusive in their praise of brains, Buddhas, and believing. I will quote some passages from the comments. Quote, one called it an openly critical, highly refreshing, and thought-provoking engagement with historical forms of Buddhist thought that takes them seriously as philosophy. This work is elegantly written and remarkably accessible, given its difficult subject matter. As brains, Buddhas, and believing also offers new avenues for rethinking Dharmakirti's anti-physicalism in his own intellectual environment, it will be of considerable benefit to philosophers as well as to more historically and philologically oriented scholars in Buddhist studies. Another commented, the standard of scholarship throughout is very high. Its argument is, I think, intrinsically of interest and importance, but the manner in which the concerns and arguments of ancient Indian philosophical discussions are brought to bear on current philosophical debates in the philosophy of mind performs an important service to the academic study of Indian philosophy. These eulogies are no exaggeration. When I read this book, I had the same impression. This is very insightful, not easy to read, but very, very insightful. So I stopped here, and I'd like to introduce Professor Daniel Arnold to have a lecture today with the title is Madhyamaka Buddhist in Defense of Radical Interpretation of Madhyamaka.
Thank you very much, Professor Shimoda, for the very generous introduction. I was first in Japan and last in Japan almost 30 years ago in high school, and so I'm very grateful for the chance to be here again, and I'm grateful, therefore, for the invitation to speak to you today. So thank you to Professor Shimoda and to Tokyo University for the chance to speak with you today. I'll go ahead and start on the talk, but I want to begin with a little bit of an explanation. The title of my talk is perhaps a little bit misleading, as I realized when the word of the talk was circulated. I got a whole bunch of emails from people who supposed that I was going to be arguing that Madhyamaka is in fact not Buddhist, and that I was going to be arguing for a very radical interpretation. In fact, my point is to respond to some critics of my interpretation who have supposed that it's radical, and I want to argue against these critics that in fact my interpretation, Madhyamaka makes very good sense as Buddhist. So apologies if you were disappointed with what I'm going to argue, but I just want to make that disclaimer. I have some PowerPoint slides which I hope will make it somewhat easier to follow the talk. Like the book itself, it's, I'm afraid, a rather difficult talk at points. The PowerPoint slides may have the effect of making the talk take longer, but I hope they also have the effect of making it a little easier to follow. Okay? So, over the years, in my second book and in my first book as well, I've advanced an interpretation of Madhyamaka that considers Nāgārjuna's arguments in terms suggested by some contemporary debates in philosophy of mind. I've argued that Nāgārjuna can be understood as rejecting the reductionist elaboration of no self, of the Anatmavada doctrine, that was epitomized for him by Abhidharma philosophy, and as doing so for the reason that the Abhidharmika's own project depends for its intelligibility on the conventionally real world. In other words, Abhidharmika explanations, and this is on my interpretation of Madhyamaka, Madhyamaka is arguing that Abhidharmika explanations make sense only relative to the very level of description they were supposed to explain. I have argued that this point is illuminated by engaging some similar arguments against physicalism in philosophy of mind. Contemporary arguments to the effect that a scientific account of the mental cannot coherently explain everything about our conscious lives. The reason for this is the same as Nāgārjuna's reason for rejecting any supposed ultimate reals. So just as for Nāgārjuna, it is only relative to the conventionally real world that an ultimately true description can even make sense. In the same way, some contemporary critics of physicalism in philosophy of mind argue that any scientific account of the mental will itself make sense only for minds, which therefore cannot be eliminated from a final account. Nāgārjuna's arguments thus urge that a conventionally true level of description cannot be eliminated from a complete account of what there is. But it makes a big difference for my interpretation that we keep always in mind that it is especially selves or persons whose reducibility is in question. Because it's not hard to understand that sunrise and sunset ultimately consist in facts about the Earth's rotation, or that heat ultimately consists in molecular motion. Why should the case of persons be any different? Surely we can understand that a scientific account of persons can work the same way. But when we are considering whether things like persons can be reduced, matters become trickier. For now we are asking whether it makes sense to think that we could explain away the very level of description at which explanations make sense. The problem is that it is persons who seek explanations of anything. It is persons who assent to or affirm any explanations as true. And Nāgārjuna's point, on my understanding, is that it matters, it makes a difference, that the very perspective from which we do philosophy is therefore always implicated in the matters under investigation. And on my interpretation, this is Nāgārjuna's point when he says, as he does in chapter 24, verse 10 of the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, that the ultimate truth, which we have to understand in order to achieve nirvana, cannot itself come into view without reliance upon ordinary usage. And typical of my interpretation of Madhyamaka is to emphasize that the conventionally real world that he says we thus depend on is above all to be characterized as involving what I would call a personal level of description. Okay, so for him to argue that the conventional cannot be eliminated and that we depend on the conventional for understanding the ultimate is precisely to argue that we depend on the reference to persons. Okay? So to make sense of my interpretation of Madhyamaka, we must therefore keep in mind that it is particularly the question of how to understand the cardinal Buddhist doctrine of anatmavada, or selflessness, that Nāgārjuna and his rivals are arguing about. So let us then frame the matter in terms of what is maybe the most basic question raised by the cardinal Buddhist doctrine. If there are no selves, if the doctrine of anatmavada is true, then what is there? If there are no selves, what is really the case? What does ultimately exist? The Abhidharma literature comprises many subtle variations on the mainstream Buddhist answer to this question. What really or ultimately exists is causally continuous series of momentary psychic and physical events, which the Abhidharmic is called dharmas. While there are, on this view, on the Abhidharma view, not really any selves, an impersonal account of causally describable psychophysical events does succeed in getting at what there really is. This version of Buddhist doctrine reflects an understanding of the two truths, according to which ultimately real, or paramartha sat existence, can be identified and can explain a conventionally real, or samriddhi sat world, whose manner of being is deficient in comparison. On my reading of Madhyamaka, it is just this view of the two truths that Nāgārjuna is most concerned to reject. For Nāgārjuna, nothing can coherently be thought to be ultimately real, since all candidates for the status of ultimately real turn out to depend for their intelligibility on something else. So, with respect to our framing question, our framing question again, if, as Buddhists say, there are no selves, then what is there ultimately? Nāgārjuna's point with respect to that question is that there is nothing that being a person really is. There is no answer to this question. There's nothing it could look like to answer the question at all. Nāgārjuna argues in this way not against existence per se, but against a particular criterion of existence, a criterion that enables us to enumerate ultimately existent things. Resisting this version of the two truths, and I emphasize resisting this version of the two truths, but not resisting anatmavada. Nāgārjuna, on my view, is arguing for the doctrine of selflessness. But resisting this understanding of the two truths, Nāgārjuna argues, much like some contemporary critics of physicalism, that the Abhidharma's basic categories, the dharmas, can themselves come into view only insofar as we always already have persons in view. Okay, but, of course, my use here of the language of persons will likely give pause, for surely this brings the doctrine of Pudgalavada to mind, Pudgalavada, or personalism. And the Pudgalavada, or personalist doctrine, people in Buddhist studies have long been taught, was heretical for pretty much all Indian Buddhists. And indeed, Nāgārjuna's commentator Chandrakirti himself developed a critique of Pudgalavada, or personalism. So it's not surprising then that some critics of my interpretation have asked whether Nāgārjuna's philosophy, on my interpretation of it, really makes sense as Buddhist philosophy. These critics worry that on my reading, Nāgārjuna would be affirming precisely what Buddhists supposedly first set out to challenge, the conventionally described world. Isn't this the same as reintroducing selves? How could one argue, as I have said Nāgārjuna does, for the ineliminable character of a personal level of description and still be a proponent of the no-self doctrine? So to give some examples of criticisms like this, Jonathan Gold writes, in an exchange between us that is forthcoming in Philosophy East and West, he writes that if it is self-contradictory to deny that we are reasoning persons, does that mean that the Buddha mistakenly contradicted himself when he affirmed no self? And Jonathan Gold further comments that it does seem rather contrary to a Buddhist view of unenlightened beings to say that there's no better description of what's happening than the ordinary way we take ourselves to be. To similar effect, Charles Goodman suggests that my highly controversial interpretation, and those are his words, that my highly controversial interpretation is obviously at odds with the Buddhist tradition's most basic claims and scriptures. And I'll give you a lengthy quote from Charles Goodman, who says that one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the Buddhist tradition was the discovery of the idea that thought and agency are made possible by and actually consist in a complex array of impersonal processes. Versions of this idea appear frequently, I'm still quoting from Charles Goodman, versions of this appear frequently in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Indeed, this is exactly what is meant by dependent arising in such texts as the Shalistambha Sutra. The prominent role of quotations from the Shalistambha Sutra in Shantideva's Shiksha Samuchaya is evidence that Madhyamakas did not reject this discovery, but built their view upon it. Arnold, on the other hand, does wish to deny this insight, in spite of the fact that the advent of scientific psychology has given it far more empirical support than it ever could have had in ancient India. Okay? So some of my critics. But what I want to argue today is that, against these critics, is that Madhyamaka, on my interpretation of it, makes perfectly good sense as an elaboration of the doctrine of Anatmavada, and makes sense, therefore, as a Buddhist position. I will begin, though, in what might not be thought a very helpful way. I will begin by invoking a thinker whose project is vast and problematic enough that he might not be thought likely to shed any light here. So I invite you to consider my interpretation of Madhyamaka in terms suggested by some things that Martin Heidegger, in Being and Time, says about Dasein. Of course, what Heidegger means by Dasein is a much debated question, and it's often unclear, for example, whether Dasein means consciousness or subjectivity, something that each one of us has, such that there is a Dasein for each person, or whether instead there's only one Dasein and each person is somehow a case of it. But whatever else Heidegger means by it, it's clear that Heidegger means by Dasein to refer to a distinctively human, or even the distinctively human way of being. And chief among Heidegger's contentions is that the history of Western philosophy has been misled by its unexamined tendency to theorize Dasein in terms of the same metaphysical categories based on and applied to objects. This point is well brought out by the way in which Heidegger characterizes his approach in terms of the famous Cartesian cogito argument. Now, Heidegger's starting point is in important ways like Descartes' rather. Just as Descartes held that philosophy had to begin with subjectivity, since nothing else is as certainly known to us, Heidegger too held that the project of a fundamental ontology had to proceed by examining that being for whom being is an issue, namely Dasein. Heidegger's aim at a fundamental ontology thus requires attention to the distinctively human way of being insofar as it is for human persons, for consciousness, for subjectivity, for Dasein, that the question of being arises in the first place. Okay? Descartes' problem, according to Heidegger, is that he concluded from this that subjectivity must therefore be another kind of thing in the world, must be a substance. As Heidegger says, I'm quoting from Being and Time, with the cogito sum, Descartes had claimed that he was putting philosophy on a new and firm footing. But what he left undetermined when he began in this radical way was the kind of being which belongs to the res cogitans, or more precisely, the meaning of the being of the sum. So when Descartes said, I think, therefore I am, what did he mean by I am? What kind of being is expressed by the verb am in that case? And much of what Heidegger wants to show regarding Dasein is just that Dasein, this distinctively human way of being, is in fact not any kind of thing at all, and that the history of Western philosophy went astray as soon as being a person was conceived in terms of being some kind of objective thing alongside all the other objects of experience. This, Heidegger says, is what kept Descartes, like Western philosophy in general, from bringing Dasein's ways of behaving, I'm here quoting Heidegger, from bringing Dasein's way of behaving into view in a manner which is ontologically appropriate. He, that is Descartes, continuing with the quote from Heidegger, he takes the being of Dasein in the very same way as he takes the being of the res extens, namely as substance. So, on Heidegger's view, to mistake Dasein as a kind of thing is perhaps especially to miss the fact that persons are essentially always projects in process. They are never fully given as already complete. Okay, so much for Heidegger. What I want to suggest is that this gives us a good way to make sense not only of my interpretation of Madhyamaka, but also of the sense my interpretation makes as elaborating the basic Buddhist doctrine of selflessness, or Anandavada. So, consider again the basic philosophical question that I said is raised by the Buddhist doctrine. Namely, if there are no selves, then what is there really? What really exists? Or to put the question more existentially, if I am not a self, what am I really? The Abhidharma strand of Indian Buddhist philosophy can be understood above all to have taken the bait of that question. So to the question, what am I really? The Abhidharmika has answered that you are really just a continuum of momentary psychophysical events. The Heideggerian insight I want to attribute to Nāgārjuna is that the Abhidharmika answer to the basic Buddhist question amounts, just like the Atma theory, just like the self theory, to positing theoretical objects, in this case dharmas, that are taken to be what we really are, that are taken to be Paramartha Sat. So Nāgārjuna's most basic worry on this Heideggerian way of putting it is that the Abhidharmika answers the question, what am I really? Nāgārjuna is instead going to refuse that question. To answer the question, what am I really, is implicitly to affirm a premise shared with the self theory, Atmavada. So whether one says, you are really an Atman, you are really a self, or you are really a continuum of momentary events, either way, there is some kind of thing or things that it makes sense to say that being a person ultimately is. Against this, I take Nāgārjuna's insight to be that there is no such thing as what you really are. The force of the Buddhist doctrine of selflessness, rather, is precisely to refuse as misguided and incoherent the question, what am I really? Indeed, the idea that this question should or can be answered, the question, what am I really? The idea that this question could or can be answered is itself the problem to overcome. Okay, where did I get this idea? Well, this Heideggerian sketch of how my interpretation of Madhyamaka works is inspired partly by an account of Madhyamaka recently ventured by Jonardon Ganeri. In his book, The Concealed Art of the Soul, Ganeri characterizes Aryadeva and Chandrakirti, two important commentators on Nāgārjuna, as having elaborated what he calls a performativist account of the language of self. I'll say more in due course about what that means. And on my understanding of Ganeri, what he means to say by that is similar to what I'm trying to get at here. Ganeri introduces his interpretation with reference to a particular verse that I want to consider a little bit, and that is chapter 10, verse 3 of Aryadeva's Chatushataka, which Ganeri translates this way. That which is self to you is not self to me. From this fixed rule, it follows that that is not self. Indeed, the construction of a sense of self arises out of the impermanent things. I'll say more in a moment about some problems with Ganeri's understanding of this verse, but first let me say how he interprets it, what he takes the significance of the verse to be. With the first half of the verse, or the first quarter verse rather, which can be more elegantly translated, "The self which is yours is not a self for me." With that first quarter verse, Aryadeva states what Ganeri characterizes as an adequacy condition on potential theories of self. What Ganeri means by that is that Aryadeva is saying that among the things that the Atman theory was supposed to explain, and the Atman theory is supposed to explain things like agency and personal identity and so forth, among the things it is supposed to explain is subjectivity. The fact that experience is always had from some perspective is always the experience of some subject. The Atman theorist, the self-theorist, therefore wants to argue, according to Ganeri, that lacking the concept of self, I would not be able to draw the distinction between what is mine and what is yours. Indeed, our capacity to make this distinction is just what Atmavadins claim to explain, what proponents of the self-theory claim to explain. Ganeri then understands the remainder of Aryadeva's verse. I'll give my translation shortly, but Ganeri begins, remember, from this fixed rule, it follows that that is not self, as arguing that Atman theories fail to meet their own criterion. The reason for this, on Ganeri's reading, is precisely that Atman theories conceive selves in terms of the kinds of things that can be objects of awareness. And I here quote from Ganeri, "Our concept of an object is a concept of something public, an inhabitant of a shared world, something that can equally well and simultaneously be the common focus of your and my attention. To reify the self, to explain our possession of a concept of self on the model of our possession of the concept of an object, is thus precisely to render one incapable of explaining why we have the concept of self in the first place." Okay, I hope you can see now why I thought of Heidegger. Because Aryadeva's characteristically Madhyamaka critique, according to Ganeri, is rather like Heidegger's critique of Descartes. For Aryadeva, the self-theory, Atmavada, although proposed to explain subjectivity, cannot in fact make sense of subjectivity at all, and this is because the doctrine amounts to the introduction of a new kind of thing in the world, an object that we can call self. Now, one advantage of Ganeri's reading is that it shows something commonly problematic for Atmavada and for the Abhidharmika's preferred explanation in terms of impersonal dharmas. And it is characteristic of Madhyamaka to hold that both views, both the self-theory and the Abhidharma elaboration of the no-self theory, both views are problematic for just the same reason, namely that they both presuppose svabhava, or essence. And of course, that's the problem with every view that Nāgārjuna argues against. He's going to say that all of the views he argues against ultimately presuppose svabhava, and that's why they're problematic. So whether persons essentially consist in selves or simply in causally continuous series of momentary events, either way, it is held that there is something more real than the ordinary persons that are supposedly being explained by these theories. But while it's an advantage that Ganeri's interpretation identifies a common problem for both kinds of answer to the question, what am I really? His interpretation has the disadvantage of being supported by a verse that Ganeri has dimly understood and poorly translated. Aryadeva's verse is in fact making a much simpler argument than Ganeri suggests. So while the full-blown performativist account of the language of self that he ultimately finds and that I want to commend, owes more to Chandrakirti's commentary than to this verse itself, it's worth pausing for a moment to consider the verse and to understand the much simpler argument the verse is making. To begin, here is how Chandrakirti introduces the point clearly at issue. Chandrakirti wrote one of the main commentaries on Aryadeva's text. Chandrakirti says, if a self were essentially existent, it would be the referent of everyone's egocentrism in the same way that it's the referent of a single person's egocentrism. For it is not the case in everyday speech that heat is the svabhava or essence of fire, but for some people not heat is. In the same way, if the self were essentially existent, it would be the self of everyone and the object of everyone's egocentrism, and it's not that way. To this effect, Aryadeva says, and here we get the first quarter verse, the self which is yours is not a self for me. While it's reasonable for Ganeri to argue that the first quarter of Aryadeva's verse gives an adequacy condition on potential theories of self, we cannot in fact understand what Aryadeva thinks follows from this observation without better understanding the verse. As Ganeri notes, Aryadeva's second quarter verse is, owing to Sanskrit Sandhi rules and certain conventions of Sanskrit manuscripts, ambiguous between two different readings. You could say, Tena Atma Niyamat Nasa, or Tena Atma Aniyamat Nasa. So one of the words either in the verse either is niyama or not niyama. One of the words in the verse either means something or the complete opposite of that. And the second reading, the one with the privative prefix, niyamat, apologies for non-Sanskritists, is recommended by the Tibetan translation of the Sanskrit. Ganeri rightly follows Chandrakirti in reading against the Tibetan, Tena Atma Niyamat Nasa, but despite the fact that he is correct in doing that, Ganeri's translation, which again is from this fixed rule, it follows that that is not self, fails to disclose the straightforward argument being made here. In fact, it is clear from Chandrakirti's gloss that we should understand the Sanskrit niyamat not as meaning from a fixed rule, that's Ganeri's translation, but as an adverb synonymous with svabhavata, or essentially. So, here's what Chandrakirti says. For that very self which is yours, the object of your egocentrism, is not a self for me because of its not being the object of my egocentrism and because of its not being the object of my own self-affection. Since this is so, accordingly, it is not invariably a self. And a self which does not exist invariably does not exist essentially. Hence, projection of a self should be abandoned. Following Chandrakirti's reading, which strikes me as clearly correct, we can translate the whole first half verse in the following way. The self which is yours is not a self for me. Accordingly, it is not invariably a self. Because the self that you take as a self isn't always and everywhere a self. It doesn't count as being essentially a self. It doesn't count as having svabhava. Aryadeva's deceptively straightforward point, it then becomes clear, is just that anything that could be thought essentially to be a self would have to be so invariably. But in fact, the same thing taken as self by one subject does not show up as self for any other subjects, and vice versa. So, the unique target of anyone's self-affection is not invariably taken as self. Rather, it is in the nature of subjectivity, and recall that this is just what the Atman theory was supposed to explain, to vary enormously, showing up uniquely for each person. But it's reasonable to ask whether anyone committed to a self-theory is really committed to thinking that just the same thing would have to show up as each person's self. So the first half of Aryadeva's verse may not support the Heideggerian interpretation I have suggested. Let's see whether the remainder of the verse gives us any help. And apologies, we're here entering one of the most difficult and dense sections of the paper. Try to hold up, it gets better. In fact, the performativist account of the language of self that Ganeri has attributed to Madhyamakas is most informed by the remainder of Chandrakirti's commentary, commenting on the second half of Aryadeva's verse. In Ganeri's translation, recall that the second half verse says, "Indeed, the construction of a sense of self arises out of the impermanent things." I would instead translate, "So the conception self certainly occurs with regard to impermanent things." Here, in any case, is what Chandrakirti, how Chandrakirti explains what follows for Aryadeva from the claim made in the first half of the verse. He says, Chandrakirti, "Since, according to the foregoing reasoning, there is never any existence of a self that is essentially established apart from the aggregates, the conception self is thus the projection of an unreal object applied to impermanent things. For, just as fire depends on fuel, in the same way a self comes into view relative to the aggregates. And insofar as it is subjected to a fivefold analysis in terms of being the same as or different from the aggregates, the self does not exist essentially. It is posited as a relative manifestation. Thus, it is established that the conception self pertains to impermanent conditions." In this very characteristic passage, Chandrakirti plays with the Madhyamaka term of art, and a term that's important for Nāgārjuna and especially for Chandrakirti, the term of art upadaya prajñapti. And Chandrakirti's many discussions of that term best support my idea that Madhyamaka is especially aimed to recover a person level of description. In particular, Chandrakirti argues that the self is made known, prajñapyate, that the self shows up, or as I have translated, comes into view, only relative to upadaya, the kinds of things, for example, the aggregates, that Buddhists had traditionally proposed as the impersonal constituents to which selves can be reduced. Now, the various kinds of impersonal things that Abhidharma took as more basic than selves are collectively referred to by Nāgārjuna and Chandrakirti as upadana, related to the word upadaya, same root, which we may translate as basis or substratum. The term upadana is the accusative correlate of the many forms of the verbal root from which it derives, upada, which means to take up or appropriate. And that's also what gives us the gerund form upadaya, which I translated as relative. The above comment on Aryadeva is one of many passages where Chandrakirti uses the words prajñapti and prajñapyate in connection with various derivative forms of upada. In these passages, Chandrakirti typically says that if selves do not come into view except relative to some impersonal basis, it's no less true that the latter does not come into view either except relative to the appropriator, the upadatar, in virtue of whom an upadana can be identified in the first place. So Chandrakirti rings the changes on this one verbal root, upada, which means to pick up or take up or appropriate. Upadana refers to the impersonal, subpersonal processes. Think of like brain events or things like that, that are objectively there, that are appropriated or that we make reference to when we talk about persons. Chandrakirti says, but you can't say that there's only that, because an upadana doesn't make sense without an upadatar. And he's here exploiting a point that the Sanskrit grammarians typically make, that you can't have one of these categories, an accusative upadana, without an agent who's acting on it. And it's all of these that are reflected, he's saying, in the gerund form upadaya. On my reading, Chandrakirti's point in saying that you can't have an impersonal basis without also having an agent that's taking them up, his point in saying that is to say that the impersonal conditions of personhood do not themselves come into view except relative to a personal level of description. So similarly, a contemporary philosopher might argue that you can't talk about brain events as constituting personhood without already supposing there's personhood there to be talked about as what you're explaining. Okay, let's briefly consider another passage in which Chandrakirti also talks this way and uses these terms. And this is in a verse by Nāgārjuna, chapter 27, verse 8 of the Mula Madhyamaka Karaka. And in that text, Nāgārjuna says, and he's using the same words here, Nāgārjuna says, thus, the self is not other than its appropriative basis, its upadana, nor is it the same as the basis, nor does it exist without the basis, but then we get the surprising conclusion, nor, however, is there any certainty that it doesn't exist. It's the fourth point, the conclusion that we're not entitled to conclude from this that there is no self. That's the surprising point in the verse, and the reason for this is that since it's only relative to the perspectives that are persons that we could identify anything as being the parts thereof, reference to selves is unavoidable if we would make sense even of Abhidharma's impersonal terms of analysis. So in other words, you can't make sense of Abhidharma explanations in terms of a bunch of fleeting dharmas unless you already have the idea of persons as what is supposed to be explained by them. Here's how Chandrakirti elaborates the surprising conclusion to the verse. And I've underlined the occurrences of the phrases involving upadaya and prajñapti. Chandrakirti says, how could it be that something made known, prajñapyate, relative to the aggregates does not exist? For the son of a barren woman, insofar as there is no such thing, is not made known relative to the aggregates. How, when there is a basis, does it make sense to say there is no appropriator? Therefore, the self's not being existent doesn't make sense either. Because of this, the certainty that there is no self doesn't make sense either. So, in other words, Chandrakirti says, a self or a person is different than a completely incoherent or non-existent object like the horns of a rabbit or the son of a barren woman. It's the kind of thing a self or a person is that actually comes into view. We have this idea relative to an upadana. So the expression made known in this passage renders Chandrakirti's word prajñapyate, which is the verbal form of the same root that gives us prajñapti. Okay, and it's the Madhyamaka term upadaya prajñapti that Chandrakirti is talking about. And the point is that the kinds of things that are such that they can be made known, the kinds of things that are different from things like the sons of a barren woman, the kinds of things that can be made known or that can come into view relative to other things are essentially different from altogether non-existent things. Indeed, to be the sort of thing that can come into view under the right conditions just is to exist as really as anything can exist. It is to exist, Chandrakirti says, as upadaya prajnapti, as a relative manifestation. The point of the Buddhist doctrine of selflessness, therefore, cannot be that there are no selves, but there is instead an impersonal basis which we mistake for such. One of these is completely unreal, the other one is real. That cannot be the point of the doctrine, because any such basis, any such upadana, could only be, like the persons it is invoked to explain, itself a relative manifestation. No impersonal explanation of persons can be thought essentially more real than persons, since it is only relative to persons that anything could be identified as explaining them in the first place. Okay, we're almost done with the really difficult part. Following Ganeri, I further suggest that Chandrakirti also means to say that the coming into view, the prajnapti, of a personal level of description is not itself a thing. This, finally, is why it makes sense to say that the self neither exists nor does not exist. Exists or doesn't exist isn't the right language for talking about self. Insofar as exists means is an object, the temporal character of anything that comes into view is just not something to which that way of being applies. This is suggested, I think, by the significant recurrence of the infinite verbal form upadaya, which suggests that the taking up or appropriating in virtue of which anything could be characterized as something upadana is always already happening. The revised version of this talk differs a little bit from what you have. You might want to refer to the PowerPoint instead for this paragraph because it's a tricky point. The force of this infinite verbal form, upadaya, suggests that before we can get to explaining anything, we must always already be taking it to be some way. Any attempt, therefore, particularly to explain persons, any attempt, in other words, to explain the very beings that take things as requiring explanation, is always already outstripped, already sublated by the very thing, the very taking that we were trying to understand. This is what it means, on my interpretation of Madhyamaka, that the ultimate truth is intelligible only relative to conventional truth. This interpretation of Chandrakirti's discussions of upadaya pradhati is consistent, I think, with Ganeri's own engagement with Chandrakirti's commentary on Aryadeva. So, here we finally get to what Ganeri says when he talks about a performativist account of the language of self. What Ganeri means by that is he means to emphasize the same features of Chandrakirti's account that I have tried to bring out with reference to coming into view as something that is always qualified by the infinite verbal form upadaya. There can be no perspective on persons that is simply given as the perspective that picks out what persons really are. One must, instead, always already be taking things some way before it can make sense to seek any explanations. Also following Chandrakirti's framing of the issue, in terms of appropriator and appropriated, Ganeri says to similar effect, and here's a lengthy quote from Ganeri, the appropriation in question, and appropriation translates upadana, the appropriation in question is to be thought of as an activity of laying claim to, not the making of an assertion of ownership. Grammatical form notwithstanding, the avowal or self-ascription of a mental state, as in, I have a pain, is not a two-place relation between me and my pain. When I say, I am in pain, I do not assert ownership of a particular painful experience. Rather, I lay claim to the experience within a stream. not entirely sure I understand what canary means here, but as much as I do, I think that the relevant difference in this quote between assertion and activity is the difference between thinking of a personal perspective on any field of activity as objectively describable, as something concretely given and able to be asserted as what is there. The difference between that and thinking that it is only insofar as someone is always already taking things, upadaya, some way, that it can make sense to think there is anything that requires explanation in the first place. So the point, when it comes to reductively analyzing persons, is that what is being explained, persons, is the very perspective from which anything could so much as make sense as an explanation. And that perspective is not a thing, but something more like an event. Okay, that's the most difficult part of the talk, so you're almost home free. Now, given my use of person talk in the foregoing, it is perhaps not surprising that the passage from Chandrakirti that I have added to Canary's discussion concerns one of the verses from Nāgārjuna, 27.8, that Tilman Vedder has characterized as betraying, quote, a certain closeness to the doctrine of the person, or Pudgalavada, at least in the careful formulation which describes the person as neither different from nor identical with the parts. Perhaps then, Vedder has gone so far as to venture that, quote, accepting a person on a preliminary level of truth as having the same reality as the constituents of a person seems to be the most individual characteristic we know of Nāgārjuna, who probably grew up, Vedder further says, in some kind of Pudgalavadan milieu. So Tilman Vedder is someone who has argued that, in fact, the personalist doctrine is in the background to Nāgārjuna's thought. Perhaps then, it is not only my own eccentric preoccupations that have inclined me to read Madhyamaka as arguing against Abhidharmikas that a conventionally true level of description, which most significantly means, on my interpretation, a person level, cannot finally be eliminated from our account. Perhaps, moreover, Nāgārjuna's having taken such a stance can be taken as evidence not of Madhyamaka's failure to be adequate to basic Buddhist doctrines, but as evidence that something like Pudgalavada may have a better claim to being an authentically Buddhist position than is typically supposed. Okay, so in other words, one might object, well, if your interpretation, if on your interpretation Nāgārjuna is a Pudgalavadan, and we all know that Pudgalavadans were unorthodox, you're therefore admitting that Nāgārjuna was unorthodox. And my point is saying, if I can show that Nāgārjuna's position makes sense as a Buddhist position, and if I can also show that it has similarities with Pudgalavada, well, maybe that's an argument that Pudgalavada makes better sense as a Buddhist position than we are typically taught. I'm especially helped here by a fine essay by Amber Carpenter called Persons Keeping Their Karma Together, and I've skipped a paragraph if you're following along in the text. Carpenter explores what the, quote, philosophical pressures might have been that drove or inspired some Buddhists to claim that persons existed, and what theoretical work such a claim might have been doing in their overall view, end of quote. Now, the characteristic claim of Pudgalavada is that even though we are without selves, Pudgalavadans are Buddhists, so they affirm Anatmavada, there is nevertheless an ineliminable person, or Pudgala, that ultimately exists in some way, albeit not in any of the ways that the tradition had taken to constitute ultimately existing. Now, of course, a Madhyamaka would never affirm that the Pudgala is ultimately existent, because Madhyamaka is all about saying that nothing is ultimately existent. But note that Pudgalavadins might be characterized not so much as asserting the ultimate reality of something additional, but as more basically challenging standard Abhidharma intuitions about what defines anything as ultimately real in the first place. Carpenter makes a cogent case for thinking of Pudgalavada as particularly challenging the dominant Abhidharma conception of the Paramartha Sat as defined by being Dravya Sat, which means existing as a substance. Like Nāgārjuna then, perhaps the Pudgalavada position really targets a criterion of existence, one perhaps not unlike the criterion that Nāgārjuna characterizes in terms of svabhava. Okay, why did Pudgalavadins want to argue this? Well, Carpenter argues that it's a concern with the problem of how or whether Abhidharmikas can identify the continua, santana, in which dharmas supposedly arise and disappear. So this is what Abhidharmikas would say that a person really is. There aren't persons, there are continua of momentary events. And it's because that's what explains why you remember things in your past but not in somebody else's past, even though there is no self. It's because the present moment which you think of as yourself is in a continuum with moments in what you think of as your past, and it's that continuum is separate from another causal continuum. So they need this idea to explain why, for example, we only remember our own pasts and not anybody else's. The problem with this, the problem with this idea of continua or santana, is that the Buddhist reductionists, for whom really existent wholes can never be found over and above the parts that constitute them, the problem is whether they're entitled to help themselves to the idea that we can identify discrete continua of causally related events at all. In other words, if you say dharmas occur in continua, isn't the idea of a continuum very much like the idea of a self? Isn't that just asserting some whole that comprises these parts? So the problem is that the kind of continuum Abhidharmikas have in mind can be picked out only relative to the personal level of description that they aim to reduce. We can, for example, only say which continuum we have in mind by referring to the person that is really said to consist therein. So how can you say which continuum we're talking about? Well, you have to say, oh, it's the one that you think of as you. Then you've just referred to a person. If that is the main thought of Pudgalavada, then I would not hesitate to say that Nāgārjuna, on my interpretation of him, is indeed rather a Pudgalavadin. For the argument I have sketched following Carpenter is clearly to the same effect as the kinds of arguments I have taken as most characteristic of Madhyamaka. For both Nāgārjuna, on my reading, and Pudgalavada, on Carpenter's, the principal concern is to show that characteristically Abhidharmika explanations of selves cannot coherently be thought to be exhaustive, and in both cases the reason is the same. Because am I missing a slide? No. The reason is the same because the impersonal dharmas proposed by Abhidharmikas as ultimately existent can themselves come into view only insofar as the conventionally existent world is already in view. Only insofar, most basically, as persons are also in view. Nevertheless, I have argued that Madhyamaka makes perfectly good sense as elaborating the cardinal Buddhist doctrine of anatmavada, or selflessness. And make no mistake, I take it that when Nāgārjuna argues, in the verse we just saw a bit ago, that the lesson of anatmavada is not that we are entitled to conclude that there is no self, he is not compromising the doctrine of anatmavada, he's arguing for it. His argument, on my reading, is that the theoretical positing of new kinds of things can never coherently be thought to tell us what we really are, for the finally simple reason that there is, and indeed can be, no such thing as what we really are. It is possible, then, to be committed to the doctrine of selflessness and yet to refuse the idea that this doctrine demands that we explain what there really is instead of the selves we thought there were. Indeed, it is reasonable to think that anatmavada, or selflessness, holds precisely that insistence on answering the question, what am I really, has all along been just the problem to overcome. This is how I understand the uncontroversial claim that Nāgārjuna's philosophical project amounts to a recovery of the conventionally existent world. So it's not controversial to say that Nāgārjuna wants to reaffirm conventional reality. What's controversial is to say that what that means is especially makes sense in terms of personhood. And it's that recovery of the conventional that represents the reason for Nāgārjuna's thinking that his position alone achieves the desired middle way, Madhyamaka, between eternalism and eliminativism. Avoidance of the eternalist extreme is easy for Buddhists. That's what you get just by being a proponent of selflessness. It's avoidance of the eliminativist extreme that really is a problem for Buddhist philosophers. And it is precisely because Nāgārjuna, though refuting the ultimate existence of anything, it's because he nevertheless affirms the conventionally existent character of persons that he can convincingly deny that his position is nihilistic, as he does again and again. Among other things, it is only in terms of a personal level of description that beings that make sense as both the objects and subjects of compassion. So Nāgārjuna will indeed argue not only that his recovery of the conventional does not compromise Buddhist doctrine, but that Buddhist doctrine only makes sense given his view. We can only make sense of things like being compassionate for suffering beings if we have things like persons in view. But one can affirm all of this and still argue, as a proponent of selflessness, that there is no kind of thing that a person ultimately is. Okay, almost done here. Thank you for your patience. I take it as uncontroversial to say that Nāgārjuna wants to show that not only ourselves dependent on all manner of things, but also that the dharmas posited by Abhidharmikas turn out to lack the independence that would qualify them as ultimately existent. So it's uncontroversial to say that Nāgārjuna argues not only for Pudgala Nairatmya, the selflessness of persons, but also for Dharma Nairatmya, the selflessness of dharmas. But the most characteristic point of my interpretation of Madhyamaka is that among the things the Abhidharmika categories depend on is the very phenomena they were invoked to explain, which means the Abhidharmika's dharmas make sense only relative to the personal level of description that both the self-theory and the Abhidharmika elaboration of no-self were supposed to explain. Despite the fact that this sounds like Pudgalavada, I have argued that Madhyamaka nevertheless makes sense as an eminently Buddhist position. where that means, above all, that it makes sense as elaborating anatmavada, selflessness. For it is a perfectly good Buddhist position to suppose that the tradition-defining problem of self-grasping consists most basically in attachment to the thought that there is something that being a person really is. The whole point for Nāgārjuna, on my reading, is there is no such thing as what you really are. While Charles Goodman is right, then, that on my reading, Nāgārjuna resists, quote, the idea that thought and agency are made possible by and actually consist in a complex array of impersonal processes, end quote. While Goodman is right that Nāgārjuna resists that, that is only because Nāgārjuna disagrees with Goodman in thinking that that idea represents, as Goodman said, one of the greatest intellectual achievements of the Buddhist tradition. In other words, Nāgārjuna disagrees with the Abhidharma strand of Buddhist philosophy, according to which this complex array of impersonal processes has the kind of svabhava that would make sense of them as ultimately existent. But that is not to refuse anatmavada or to compromise the doctrine. It is to argue for an interpretation of it. Okay, I will conclude then by making one last gesture towards the sense my interpretation makes as a Buddhist interpretation. So I want to invoke here, and you can skip to the last two paragraphs of the talk if you're following, the category of the avyakrita vastuni, or the Buddha's unanswered questions. These unanswered questions are found, sorry, the last three paragraphs, not two. The case of the unanswered questions are found throughout Buddhist scripture, in the Pali Suttas and in lots of other scriptures besides. And in these episodes, the Buddha famously declines to answer questions such as whether or not a Buddha exists after death, and whether or not the self is identical with the body. What is meant by the Buddha's silence in response to these questions is, of course, subject to interpretation. One interpretation of these is suggested by B.K. Matilal, who writes that these unanswered questions were not regarded by the Buddha as really unanswerable. It would be a wrong interpretation if we believed that the Buddha left these questions entirely unanswered. The Buddha used, in fact, the vibhajya method to give answer to these questions. By the vibhajya method, Matilal means, quote, a method of analysis and differentiation which consists in breaking up the whole into its component parts, in which way one seeks a satisfactory answer to such unanswered questions. Clearly, this describes precisely the project of Abhidharma, which characteristically seeks to answer the most basic questions about what is finally real. But that is not, in fact, the main interpretation in the tradition of the unanswered questions. According to the mainstream interpretation of the unanswered questions, the point is not that the Buddha answers these questions on other occasions. The point is that the Buddha declined to answer because the questions themselves make sense only given premises that the Buddha that it's precisely the point of Buddhism to refute. So to ask, for example, whether or not the Buddha exists after death is to propose that he existed before death. But insofar as the whole point of the tradition's cardinal doctrine is to deny that he ever existed, to deny that he existed as a self or as something ultimately existent, insofar as that's the whole point, the question's implicit premise should not be validated by the giving of an answer. I want to suggest that on my interpretation of Madhyamaka, Nāgārjuna's elaboration of the Buddhist Anatmavada doctrine exhibits the very same logic. When he claims that the arguments for selflessness should not be understood as warranting, quote, the conviction that it doesn't exist, Nāgārjuna effectively urges that the point of the doctrine of selflessness is misunderstood if that doctrine is thought to require that we specify what really exists instead of selves. The point of the doctrine, rather, is to say that nothing at all exists in the way that we are habitually committed to thinking that ourselves exist. Nāgārjuna can reasonably think, though, that our framing question, if there are no selves, what then does really exist, makes sense only given a premise that it is just his point to reject. So, the basic ontological question that launches and guides the whole Abhidharma project, namely the question, what is ultimately existent, is a question that Nāgārjuna thinks can only lead to incoherent answers. But this is an eminently Buddhist position, a position that is not only not at odds with, but that actually counts as elaborating the Buddhist tradition's cardinal doctrine. If he is asked, what does being a person ultimately consist in, Nāgārjuna joins the Buddha in refusing the question, which is a perfectly sensible way for a proponent of the no-self doctrine to respond. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking, stimulating, radical presentation. May I have a few minutes in summarizing your collection, which is for the audience? ちょっと日本語で私が理解できた限りのことを先ほど、レジュメに書きましたので、説明をさせていただきたいと思います。昨晩、ちょっとペーパーを読みながら書き始めましたので、ちょっと追いつかないところがあるんですけども、今日の問題提起はそのハイデッカーの例を出されたようにですね、レジュメの2番目から見ていただければと思うんですけど、これ全部説明することはいたしません。人間である仏教をそのパーソナルフットとかパーソナリティとかセルフ、アイアンというのが出てきました。でこれを、日本語で一つの言葉にしていくと非常に困難なことなんですけれども、人であること、人間であること、それから自己であること、それからさらに、一人称、ファーストプレスですね、一人称を発するということ、こういう言語との言語行為論といいますか、との関わりを背景とした、中観派の解釈であり、それから、人柄バーダですね、全く新たな理解というものだったと思います。で、そのハイデガーのそのダーザインというものが純粋にこれが人間的なありようのものであって、それはいかなる客観物としても立て得ないものであると。でその過程的な、ところです、そのプロジェクション・イン・プロセスとおっしゃってましたけども、そういうものであるということですね。でそこにその特にその三国私であることということが大問題になってくると。でこのあり方だけはいかなるその第三の事態にも還元のしようのないことであると。そしてその言語を発する時にその発された言語がどこに関わっているかということですね。そこを問いにされていたと思います。で、 阿弥陀ルマの場合には極めて、単純に心理的なあるいは身体的ですね、そのサイコフィジカルなそういうなんかオブジェクトに据えてしまっているということで、これは肝心なその自己の問題というの説明ができていないという指摘であると思います。そしてそのアリアデバの絵を引いてそのガネリーのですね解釈を、持ってきて論じて書いてまして、でアリアデバのその自己は2の4のところですが、自己にとっては自明なんだけれども、他者との間においては同じように自明には決してならないっていうあり方をしている。ここですね、中観派のそのナガラジュナの立場というのが鮮明に現れてくる問題の起点だと思います。でそして3番目になりますが、龍樹パーダヤプラジネプティという大事なフレーズをめぐって解釈しておられてました。非常に微妙な訳をセンシティブに使っておられるので、私はどう訳したらいいかとても難しいんですけども、自己という観念は無常なる物事、これ語文ですけどね、に関わってと訳されていると、with regard to という訳を使ってられたところがありますし、それから、全体を通してはですね、その relative to と、語文に関わって何か第三の出来事に関わって、自我というのが、comes into view。これはおそらく日本語で言うとそれが現れてくるっていうような言葉じゃないかと思うんですけれども、視野に入るっていうことですけれども、自我というのはそこから現れてくるような事態ですね。そしてこれが一人称の今回はそのところがテーマにされて、特になかったですけれども、前の著書を通してそのファーストプーソンっていうのがいかに重要であるかということを取り上げられていました。そしてその場合ウパーダーナがあっても、それがですね、そのインディビジュエイトされると、人格化されるとか個別化されるといいますか、自己化されるといいますか、というその個別化されないとですね、自己が現れてこない。バーダートリー、すみません、それミススペルですね、映画ロングですけど、バーダートリーというものが現れてこない、その様相にならないことには自我の問題というのが現れてこないと。で、さらにはそのアサーションとアクティビティですね。The distinction between assertion and activity can be referenced to contrast between constitutive and performative. Roughly. だから事実確認的な述定的な言葉と、それと行為遂行的な言葉というですね、この2つのことを開催の問題にされていて、そして人柄論者を新たに身につけていくと。で阿弥陀の場合には人柄の内アートミアというか、前提であるということは、その人柄の問題っていうか、その自己の問題っていいますか、今ちょっと先生が話をされたその射程の問題はですね、視野に入っていない、ダルマナイアートミアに至って初めて自我の問題がきちんとした言語で語れるようになると。説明されるべきものの次元と同次元の言語を用いているという阿弥陀ルマの問題と同時的だったと思います。でそれはブッダの無期の問題と最後に整合していくという話だったように思います。